Hello, everyone.
Patrick.
Good afternoon. The Center for Arts and Humanities at AUB has the pleasure to be hosting Doyle Avant today for a lecture entitled Who Shot the Arab? Doyle graduated from New York University in 1991 from in dramatic writing, film, and theater. He's a playwright whose works include Angels, The Last Thing You'll Ever See, The Envy of Water, Radio Silence. Zero, Saddam Hussein sings songs of love live at Purgatory Lounge. He's presently working on two related projects, a novel entitled Maman Died Today and a play entitled Merceau's Labyrinth. He also turns up every once in a while at the Department of English where he teaches screenwriting and film production. Please join me in welcoming Doyle Avant.
For coming. I'd like to thank the folks at the Center for Arts and Humanities for all your support. Abdul Rahim Abu Hussein, Rita Basel, who you just saw, and Rania Salha. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Fadlo Khouri and Nadia Al-Sheikh for their support of the Center for Arts and Humanities and for the AUB Theater Initiative, which what I'm going to be talking about is kind of a first cousin of. I'd like to thank Serene Hoot, back there, chair of the English department. There she is, for she keeps putting me on the schedule and letting me come to work. And Marwa Ramdan, an angel of grace behind Serene's throne, who is a force. I would also like to thank Patrick McGreevy, who helped me out in my time of dire need. Thank you for that. Patrick, don't go. Don't go. I'd also like to thank Robert Myers, who I saw, there he is back there, who is basically responsible for me being at AUB in the first place. So if you're not happy with the talk, you can take it up with that guy back there.
Sorry about that.
And last but not least, I would like to thank Sonia Metcher-Tassi, who a year ago took me to lunch and told me, you have to apply for this fellowship, without which I probably would have forgotten all about it, which just goes to show you that we all need at least one German in our lives. So, Sonia and the rest of you, thank you. You've all given me the gift of time, and as someone who has a lot more of it behind me than in front of me, it's very precious. So, I'll be talking about Albert Camus' The Stranger, exploring some voids and omissions in the text, and look at some different cinematic and literary responses to the book, which I think of as artistic recreations of the scene of the crime, including a play and a novella I'm working on. This film footage that you were looking at earlier was actually the Battle of Algiers and The Stranger kind of blending and morphing into each other, which is how I want to think about these two works. Okay. So, after 76 years, why are we still talking about this book? I would propose that the reason we're still talking about it is because after all this time, we still have not quite solved the crime of the narrative, or even come to some agreement as to what crime has actually been committed. We haven't apprehended the suspects in either sense of the word, or decided which suspect is really the most responsible. Is it Camus, Meursault, Jean-Paul Sartre, the Nobel Committee, or millions of young readers everywhere who read the book and think that the narrator is pretty cool, other than the fact that, oops, he kills an Arab? All of which suggests another question. Is writing a book about killing an Arab on a beach ever just as bad as actually killing an Arab on the beach? And by the way, every time I say the word Arab, I want you to imagine my two fingers up in the air like this, because if I keep doing that, these ligaments will give out by the time that we're done here. So, let's consider our two suspects. Camus and Meursault, who, as you can see, bears an uncanny resemblance to Marcello Mastroianni for reasons that I'll bring up later. We know that Meursault pulled the trigger, and we know that Camus wrote Meursault, but aside from their names, who are they? For clues, let's consider the facts of the case. Meursault gets a telegram that inspires what are, for better or worse, some of the most memorable opening lines in Western literature. Maman died today, or perhaps yesterday, I don't know. Meursault goes to the wake and has coffee and a cigarette while sitting beside his mother's coffin, which, spoiler alert, is going to cause him some big problems later on. If you ever want to kill someone on the beach for no reason, never, ever have a cigarette next to your mother's coffin. The following morning, Meursault goes to the funeral and buries his mother and takes the bus back to Algiers. The next morning, he goes to the beach and meets the beautiful Marie. They go to the movies. Well, they swim first. They go to the movies. Meursault takes her back to his place, et voila, Meursault has an inexplicably devoted girlfriend all of a sudden. A couple of days later, Meursault's thuggish pimp neighbor Raymond invites him upstairs for dinner, during which Raymond tells the story about this woman who he claims on very flimsy evidence is cheating on him. Now, so he beats her up. The problem is he still doesn't feel like she's been punished enough, but even worse, he still has the hots for her. So what he wants to do is sleep with her one last time, spit in her face, and then toss her out. And he wants to write a letter that will lure her back into his arms for her punishment. And so he asked Meursault if he wouldn't mind writing the letter for him. And Meursault, and this is very important, without expressing any opinion about the subject one way or the other, or any enthusiasm about the project, agrees to write the letter. Now, at this point, he doesn't do three very important things. So he agrees to write the letter. Meursault then tells us that when Raymond tells me the woman's name, I realized that she was Moorish, or an Arab. However, he doesn't do three important things. He doesn't tell us the woman's name. He doesn't express any idea about the fact that she's Arab. And he also doesn't tell us, most importantly, what he writes in the letter. All of which, depending on how you think about it, is either very clever narrative strategy on Camus' part, or an illegal withholding of crucial evidence, a literary crime against reading humanity, which I say somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But for me, this letter, this unknown contents of this letter are the missing Dead Sea Scrolls of this entire narrative. Whatever's in the letter, whatever he writes, channeling Raymond, does the trick. The Arab girlfriend comes back, she gets her beating. A few days later, Meursault and Raymond and Marie go to the beach to visit a friend. The men take a walk on the beach, and along the way, who do they run into but Raymond's sister's very angry, very Arab brother, who's mad at her for the beatings his sisters had, among other indignities. The two men fight. At some point, the brother pulls a knife. Raymond is slashed superficially, and then the Arabs run off. Afterwards, Raymond returns to the beach furious. He's looking for this guy, and Meursault tags after him. They spot the Arabs sleeping in the shade of this rock with a cool spring. Raymond takes out a gun, at which point Meursault bizarrely and inexplicably decides that this is the moment in his life that he's going to express some moral opinion about something. And he tells Raymond that it would be wrong for him to shoot this guy in cold blood. Give me the gun, take him man to man. And so he gives Meursault the gun, but the Arabs take off, and it seems like the storm has passed. They walk back to the cottage. However, right when they get there, Meursault, again, inexplicably, decides to turn around and walk back down towards the beach. He gets to the rock, and he finds that the Arab has returned. He has heat stroke. All he wants to do is reach the cool of the water and the shade. And so he takes one step forward. The Arab pulls the knife. The sun hits the blade. It blinds Meursault. And then, before he knows it, almost magically, the gun's in his hand. The trigger gives. He shoots. And there's a dead Arab on the beach. I knew that I had shattered the harmony of the day, the exceptional silence of a beach where I'd been happy. And then I fired 4 more times at the motionless body where the bullets lodged without leaving a trace. And it was like knocking 4 quick times on the doors of unhappiness. Okay, now, at this point, since we are talking about crimes and suspects and confessions, I should probably make a confession of my own, which is that I don't really like The Stranger, okay? Not that it offends me or I don't like the message. I just don't think it's a very good book, okay? I said it, all right? Barely anything happens. The description is occasionally vivid, but mostly pretty lazy. There are lots of compelling or actually potentially compelling scenes that fall completely flat because the narrator just can't seem to be bothered to express them and depict them any better. And Meursault, I'm sorry, but when you get right down to it, he's not really that interesting. The other part of this confession is that at the same time, another part of me does like this book, okay? Partly because I have a 30-year relationship with it, and it's too late to get a divorce at this point. But mostly because it makes me think. And it makes me not really know what to think about it. After all these years, I cannot decide whether The Stranger is a troubling but brilliant work of literature or the most overrated book of the 20th century, which, let's face it, was a long and highly overrated century. Now, one reason for my dilemma about Camus as a suspect is that either intentionally or by complete accident, he has woven a remarkable literary alibi for his character, for his book, and for himself. But do these alibis hold up? Now, the crux of Meursault's alibi is much simpler, much more slippery, I should say, and holds up. The crux of his alibi is that he basically keeps his mouth shut about anything that really matters. Think about it. He does 2 things in this entire book. He writes a letter, he kills a guy, and then does not spend 5 seconds thinking about them for the next 75 pages. Okay? He is a narrator in psychological absentia. It is a narrative of omission. He literally has no story. Okay. Now, and when someone like Meursault has no story, the tendency is to give him one, okay? To put words in his mouth, thoughts in his head, and recreate the books in our mind in a way that is not exactly the book that Camus wrote. I'll give you a little example. In 1942, a few months after the book comes out, this guy, Marcel Arland, who's a French critic or reviewer, writes this glowing review of The Stranger, in which he quotes Meursault at the end of the story as he awaits his date with the guillotine. He says, "I didn't lie to myself. I mistreated no one. With my death a few days away, I am accepting myself completely and committing to my life, my only possession, fragile but unique." Okay? And even though it was in the context of this great review, Camus reads this and goes through the ceiling, because there are no words like this in the book at all. Meursault never says this anywhere, not remotely close. So it's like this reviewer was somehow so affected by something that Meursault does or says or doesn't do that he channels him and cooks up the speech for him out of thin air. Now, the first English translation by Stuart Gilbert much more subtly does something very similar. He doesn't cook up entire speeches, but he makes slight additions to many, many lines throughout the book. Okay, for instance, When Raymond takes out his gun, Meursault tells us, I realize that you can shoot or not shoot, and that really it amounts to the same thing, which, coming from Texas and growing up shooting guns like my entire childhood, this is just about the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. These are two very different things. And it's also not what Camus said. He only said half of this. He said, you can shoot or you can not shoot. And then Gilbert comes in and sort of Meursault-splains and says, they both amount to the same thing, right? So 1943, Sartre, this is the Gilbert translation. Sartre enters the crime, pipe and all, and writes something called The Explication of the Stranger, in which he has all kinds of things to say about the novel, as the first encounter with the absurd, how Camus' sentences were like desert islands whose verbs conceal their verbality, and it's a page-turner. So the only thing that you really, for our purposes, need to remember about this essay is that it is basically the ultimate benediction and wastification of the stranger from literary on high. Sartre gives this book his blessing. He recreates crime as canon, and the book sets off on this trajectory and a process that culminates 14 years later with Camus winning the Nobel Prize. Followed by the iconic trench coat and cigarette photographs, the Camus postcards, the Camus coffee cups, the Camus posters on dorm room walls everywhere, and hundreds of thousands of complete college essays pondering Meursault's every utterance or lack thereof. So that with time, the book becomes not just a text, but a text plus a phenomenon surrounding it. So 20 or 30 years pass, and along come people like Conor Cruz O'Brien and Edward Said, and they start pushing back against the text and the phenomenon surrounding it, with their own critical recreations of this book, which highlight concerns that are mostly familiar to us now. First, that there's something inherently racist and colonial about this book, that in a country where 90% of the population is Algerian, there are only two Arabs, and I'll bring out my fingers again, in the story, one of which is a floozy, and the other which is the floozy's hot-headed, knife-wielding brother. To say nothing about the fact that since this is Algiers and has a big Kabyle population, these Arabs are quite likely not even Arabs, okay? Said goes on a little further and writes that the book actually lays severe and ontologically prior claims to Algeria's geography and should be seen in the context of French efforts to make it and keep it French. He talks about Meursault's trial being either a surreptitious or unconscious justification of French rule or an ideological attempt to prettify it. Okay, now on the one hand, I agree with Edward Said because he's a lot smarter than I am, and he's also right about this. But there's also a peculiar paradox at work here, which is that if you're French and you've got an empire and Meursault is your guy and the stranger is your bulwark to hold up the colonial order, your empire is in trouble, okay? The ship be sinking, and it is no surprise that only 20 years later, this empire comes crashing down, okay? As to prettifying the colonial justice system, okay, during Camus' trial, the prosecution emphasizes what? Meursault smoking a cigarette next to his mother's coffin as damning evidence that he is guilty, okay? Now, Camus doesn't come right out and say this, but the logic is fairly simple. Focusing on the Arab victim's humanity would have been a losing legal strategy. So the prosecution erases the Arab, and Meursault gets sentenced to death, which he deserves. But the result of this trial is not exactly a ringing endorsement of Western so-called civilization. Now, for me, the irony in all of this is that, and I think completely by accident, In a sense, Camus has written a searing indictment of the prevailing colonial order of the day. Okay? He presents us with a sociopathic world as seen through the eyes of an unrepentant sociopathic murderer. Okay? None of which shows France in a particularly good light. Now, mind you, I do not think this was his intention, and it's obviously certainly not the only way that you can look at this book. It's kind of a bizarre way to look at this book. But it's interesting to think that in another alternate universe, if, after publishing The Stranger, Camus had gone on to throw his lot with the FLN and fight for Algerian independence, this idea of The Stranger as searing indictment of colonialism would be the way that we look at this book. Okay? The exact same text would become a completely different book. It would become a novella of resistance, which it is not, because of course that is an alternate universe Camus. The Camus in this universe had this to say about Algeria. As far as Algeria is concerned, national independence is a formula driven by nothing but passion. There has never been an Algerian nation. Besides the Arabs, Jews, Turks, Greeks, Italians, and Berbers would be equally entitled to claim leadership of this potential nation. The size and duration of the French settlement in particular are enough to create a problem that cannot be compared to anything in history. The French of Algeria are also natives in the strongest sense of the word. There he is, Camus, getting down with his inner Israeli there. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this next section in which I ask the question, is Meursault a racist or not? But if you want to know the answer, you can ask me in the Q&A, because I've got the answer. All right, we're going to shift gears, because, I mean, really, at this point, we probably need another critical review of The Stranger like we need another Donald Trump tweet. Although I would be interested to read Donald Trump's tweets if he had something to say about The Stranger. And as a way of procrastinating working on this talk, I cooked up a couple, which the Donald is welcome to use and claim as his own. All right? And then there's this. I actually agree with part of this tweet. Wouldn't it be nice if he was limited to not 144 characters, but 3? Bad, sad, mom, hi. Anyway, enough about the Donald. Okay, let's get into some other recreations of the scene of the crime. All right. I trust that most of you probably know this one. We have Battle of Algiers, the 1966 film dramatizing events that occurred 10 years earlier, directed by this guy, Gilles Pontecorvo, and produced by this guy, Youssef Sadi, who plays himself in the movie. The film begins with a tortured Algerian leading the French to Ali Lapointe's hideout. Okay. The next 2 hours is a long flashback which charts Ali's path from 3-card Monte playing small-time hoodlum to legendary FLN fighter. Okay. Houses get blown up, and in one of the most sublime sequences of cinematic history, beautiful women flirt their way through French military checkpoints with bombs in their bags, and go to cafes and look around and blow them up. All right. Then the Paras come to town, led by our favorite colonel, Colonel Mathieu, who seals off the Kasbah. The French detain and torture hundreds, thousands. They disappear, thousands, and slowly track down, kill, or imprison the FLN militants in Algiers. Towards the end, Ali and his group are the last ones left in the Kasbah. The French find his hideout, but Ali refuses to surrender. The French blow up his building, and the Battle of Algiers is over. The French have won, but then 5 years later, the Algerians win their independence. Okay. Now, this film obviously is not a direct response to The Stranger. Okay, there's no Meursault, there's no Arab killed on the beach. But in a sense, I do think it is a recreation of the scene of the crime, which is Algeria, okay? Presenting the scene in a way that populates it with actual Algerians who aren't hookers or their angry knife-wielding brothers, places Meursault's world in the context of the struggle to overturn it, okay? And last, through vivid descriptions of extrajudicial arrests, torture, and killing, it demonstrates the lengths to which the French would go to keep Algeria safe for all the Meursaults to swim and kill Arabs on the beach whenever they want to. Okay. I'm actually not going to go into any further depth about this movie because, like, if I start talking about it much more, I will never get to the end of it. It's like Americans doing military action. It's easy to start, but they never stop. But I basically want to keep it kind of floating out there, both the film, the historical event, and the rest of the war as a sort of as a narrative we can use to recreate and combine with the narrative of The Stranger. The next recreation I want to look at is Lo Straniero, which is the film that I was blending in with the Battle of Algiers in the beginning. This is a 1967 version of The Stranger that was mostly forgotten until fairly recently, directed by another Italian, Luchino Visconti, and also in production in Algiers at the same time that the Battle of Algiers was. Now, in my opinion, this recreation of The Stranger is a well-intentioned failure, which is a shame because Visconti's intention was to make something much more interesting than a straight, faithful film adaptation of a book. What Visconti wanted to do was change the temporal setting of The Stranger, move it from this vaguely 1930s nether time and reset it towards the end of the War of Independence, okay, which would have been fascinating. So how does this war end? We know about the Battle of Algiers, but a sort of less known part of the war is the much stranger end of it. By 1960, this fellow here, Charles de Gaulle, has basically come to the conclusion that he wants to be rid of Algérie française. Okay, he wants to negotiate sovereignty, independence, not out of any high-minded ideas about liberté, égalité, or any other té. It's because de Gaulle runs the math, does the numbers, and comes to the conclusion that Algeria is a big money loser. Time to wash our hands of it, okay? Not surprisingly, the Pied Noir, the Europeans of Algeria, are furious with de Gaulle. And so are a lot of the French military who've been fighting there for 7 years. They are so unhappy that in May of 1961, 5 dissident generals, along with their regiments, stage a military coup and take over Algiers in the hope that the entire French army would rise up and depose de Gaulle. When I first started reading about this history, it kind of blew my mind because I had no idea, okay? Now, and this is a serious coup. For 24 hours, there is a real possibility that a massive airborne invasion of mainland France will be launched from Algeria with thousands of paratroopers landing on Paris and taking over the capital and arresting the president. One of the principal, this is a newspaper, one of the principal figures in this coup attempt was the guy, not de Gaulle, but the guy on the right, Colonel Yves Godard, okay, who 5 years earlier had been the principal counterintelligence mastermind most responsible for identifying, tracking down, and destroying the FLN networks during the Battle of Algiers. He's also, curiously, one of the 4 or 5 military officers who serves as a model for this guy, Colonel Mathieu, in the film. Okay. All right, so back to the 1961 coup, a combination of bad luck, bad planning, bad weather. 4 days later, the coup falls apart, at which point Godard and the other officers go underground. They team up with extremist pied noir whack jobs and AWOL soldiers to form something called the OAS, the Organisation d'Armée Secrète, which quickly becomes, or just is, an out-and-out terrorist organization that goes on a year-long bombing, bank robbing, killing spree that is as bizarre as it is brutal. By February 1962, OAS deltas are murdering an average of 30 to 40 people every day on the streets of Algiers. This reaches a crescendo on February 27th when, in the course of 1 hour, 13 people are killed in Algiers Centre-Ville in a 500-meter radius of each other in completely unrelated incidents. A typical OAS afternoon involved Delta squads having lunch and drinks at a cafe, then hopping on their Vespas for a ratonnade, or for a rat hunt, where they would ride randomly around, shooting down any Arabs they happen, or Algerians they happen to come across. The historian Paul Heinesart recounts scenes where OAS deltas would sit at a cafe, spot an Algerian pedestrian walking by, get up from their table, calmly walk over, shoot him, and then calmly sit back down and finish their lunch, surrounded by onlookers who would also calmly go about their business. So cinematically, artistically, it would be fascinating to place Meursault in this context, a completely depraved, murderous Algérie française, where killing an Arab probably wouldn't get you in much trouble, okay, whether you'd smoked a cigarette next to your mother's coffin or not. In spring of 1962, Algiers streets are full of Meursaults, or Vespa-riding, liquor-addled murder machines who actually make Meursault look like a bit of a mama's boy. Unfortunately, Visconti was unable to make this film because Camus' widow, Francine, vetoes this. She wants the film to be faithful to the novel, which was, actually she wants the film to be more faithful than Albert was to her. Which is too bad because the film that Visconti does make it has some interesting things about it, but it's a B minus movie, okay? You've got Marcello looking good, and Anna Karina looking even better as Marie. You may have seen her in some Jean-Luc Godard films. There she is, in A Band Apart. At the time, Anna Karina was married to Jean-Luc Godard, unhappily. When she was offered the role in Lo Straniero, she asked Godard if he thought that she should do the movie, and he was like, "Khalas, just do whatever you want. If you take nothing away from our time together, if your wife ever asks you if it's okay to go away for a few months on the Mediterranean to make a movie in which she plays Marcello Mastroianni's lover, and you don't really care, the marriage is in trouble." Okay? The film is also in trouble, and it's the kind of trouble that not even Ali Lapointe can save us from. Because the strangest, in my mind, irony of this movie is that Brahim Hajjaj, the actor who plays Ali Lapointe in the Battle of Algiers, is also in Lo Straniero for about 7 seconds. Let's look. Oops, not that one. Here we go. Okay, this is when Marie, Raymond, and Marcello are going to go to the beach. They're going to get on the bus, and the Arab brothers have been following Raymond around, so he's nervous about it. Okay. Give you some volume. Yes, if you blinked it, you missed it. There he is, Ali Lapointe. Okay? Now, take a wild guess which role Brahim Hajjaj plays in Lo Straniero. If you guessed the nameless Arab who gets killed on the beach, you guessed wrong. No, Ali Lapointe is reduced to playing the nameless Arab friend on the beach, after which he promptly disappears from the film, and then the film itself disappears. The idea of it always being much more interesting than anything that is actually on the screen. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is move on to what I think is a successful recreation of the scene of the crime and response to the stranger, which is the Merceau investigation, written by this guy here, Kamel Daoud, who's a journalist from Oran, Algeria, and I think is super cool looking too. He's not the Algerian Camus. Camus is the French Kamel Daoud, don't you think? Chapter 1. Mama's still alive today. She doesn't say anything new now, but there are many tales she could tell, because unlike me, I've rehashed this story in my head so often, I can't even remember it. I mean, it goes back more than a half century. It happened, and everyone talked about it. People still do. But they mention only one dead man. They feel no compunction about doing that, even though there were two men. Yeah, two. Why does the other one always get left out? Well, the original guy was such a good storyteller, he managed to make people forget his crime, whereas the other one was a poor and illiterate that God created apparently for the sole purpose of taking a bullet and returning to dust. An anonymous person who didn't even have time to be given a name. I'll tell you up front, the other man, the murder victim, was my brother. There's nothing left of him. There's only me left to speak in his place, sitting in this bar, waiting for condolences that no one's ever going to give. But please, understand me. I'm not speaking either in sorrow or anger. I just want to see justice done. And I don't mean the justice of the courts. I mean the justice that comes when the scales are balanced. Okay. What Kamel Daoud does, is take an Edward Said critique and then form an entire novel around it. Okay? And he also takes that story and collides it with the War of Independence. Unlike Merceau, Haroun, our narrator, identifies and humanizes the victim of the crime. Okay? He gives his brother a name, Musa, and he also vividly brings him to life, creating someone that might sound vaguely familiar. This is how he describes him. A quick-tempered man with a fondness towards impromptu boxing matches. A simple young man from the poor quarters of Algiers, an invincible, long-awaited hero, a savior with two tattoos, one on his forearm with the words, "Shut up," the second on his chest with the words, "March or die." All of these descriptions of Musa also describe Ali Lapointe, not just the Ali in the movie, but the historical Ali who had the exact same tattoos that Musa has. Okay, this is the real guy. In fact, when the French blow up the building that Ali Lapointe is hidden in, his body is so disfigured by the explosions that the only way they're able to know for sure that it's him is that they see the tattoo, those words, march or die. And so Moussa is another Ali Lapointe, but he's an Ali before his time, not a rebel without a cause, but a rebel without a revolution. Thus, when he's killed, he's not a martyr, he's just a dead Arab on the beach. But a dead Arab with a living mother who is determined to see justice done. 2 days after independence, on July 5th, 1962, in the middle of the night, Haroun and his mother hear a sound in the shed outside the house. The mother takes a gun that she's found, and they go and investigate. And they find that there's a pied noir hiding there. The mother puts the gun in Haroun's hand and forces him to kill the Frenchman, thus balancing the scales. Now, what's interesting is that Haroun actually kills the Frenchman better than Meursault kills the Arab, meaning he humanizes this dead man, not just his brother, but his victim. He gives him a name, Joseph Larquet. He describes him in great detail, recounting times that he's run into him around town. He says he's not a good person or a bad person, not an innocent one or a guilty one. He's just a guy in the wrong place, in the wrong country, at the wrong time, and so I killed him. He shoots him twice. Unlike Camus, he saves his ammunition. Also, unlike Meursault, who shoots the Arab and then doesn't think about him for 5 seconds later, Haroun thinks about Joseph constantly. He doesn't regret killing him, but he acknowledges the significance of the act both to the dead man and to himself. Okay? That the act of murder, and he calls it murder, permanently sets him apart, makes him a stranger in his own land and even unto himself. Okay? Now, the investigation into Joseph's murder has its own absurd, stranger-esque twist. Haroun is arrested and interrogated, and his interrogator berates him for killing a Rumi, or a Frenchman. Actually, not for killing him, but for killing him too late, after independence and not before it. Donc, if you kill a Frenchman on July 5th, it's murder. If you kill him on July 3rd, it is a heroic act of revolutionary resistance. Which brings us to my own modest and still in progress contribution to the recreation of our crime. Maman died today. Chapter 1. 2 things happened today. Maman died, and I started writing my book. I got the news about Maman a little before lunch. A telegram from the old folks' home. Maman deceased. Burial tomorrow. Deepest sympathy. The old folks' home is in Marengo, 80 or so kilometers south of Algiers. If I make the 2 o'clock bus, I can do the vigil and the burial and be back by tomorrow night. I go to the boss's office and ask him if it's okay to take the rest of the day off, but he doesn't look too thrilled. Yes, so really you're asking for today and tomorrow off. Sorry, it's not my fault. And as soon as the words are out of my mouth, I'm annoyed. I mean, why am I apologizing? He's the one who should be saying how sorry he is. I mean, what does he think? I'm just making this up? In the end, he says I can go, but it's like he's doing me this big favor. I float through Bab el-Oued. The tall, rail-thin green grocer meticulously wipes every last speck of dust off the apples. 2 ancient men play backgammon surrounded by a dozen equally ancient spectators. At the butcher's, the agitated chickens go cluck, cluck, cluck in their wire prisons awaiting execution. Just another day. But all the shapes and sounds and colors are somehow more there than when I walked these streets just a few hours ago. It's like I've wandered into a movie, but I have no idea how long the movie is going to last and whether I have to sit through the whole thing. I'm an amateur to death, a virgin. In fact, it doesn't even really feel like Maman is actually dead, and maybe she's not. Maybe there was a mix-up at the old folks' home and they sent the telegram to the wrong son. But I guess when I see her, reality will set in and she'll really be dead. So what I'm thinking is that Meursault's receiving this telegram, the news of his mother's death, is the moment that he is born or born again as a writer on the outside looking in. as a stranger, observer, recorder of his own life. And then every chapter ends with him rushing home to his kitchen, sitting down, and writing down everything that's happened since the last installment. And one of the things that I most want to explore with this is the relation that this alternate étranger, in this alternate étranger, is Meursault's relationship with this thug, pimp neighbor, Raymond. Now, Camus' Raymond is a bit of a lowlife, kind of disgusting slime ball, and yet Meursault has no opinion about him. Okay? He agrees to write the letter the way you might agree to hold a box for someone while they fished around for their keys. My Raymond is also a complete rogue, but more in the Stanley Kowalski in Streetcar Named Desire school of rogues. I mean, he's bad, but he's Marlon Brando, okay? And I want to create a Meursault who is actively and artistically fascinated by this guy, okay? Even attracted to him. Not sexually necessarily, but he's attracted to him. Because Raymond is something of a stranger himself. He's a pimp hoodlum, living on the margins of society, carrying on this illicit, erotic, and sometimes violent affair with this Arab woman. He lives right next door, but he might as well live in another world. He is material, okay? So that when Raymond asks Meursault to write this letter and lure the girlfriend into bed, Meursault isn't indifferent. He's enthusiastic. He throws himself into the task because the idea of doing this excites him as an artist. To psychologically inhabit a complete stranger and get that down onto the page, okay? And then he reads the letter back to him, and Raymond's like, wow, that's me. Like, how did you do that, okay? So I take this dynamic of artist-subject fascination further by expanding an incidental moment in The Stranger. In chapter 5, there's this moment where Meursault goes to his favorite cafe. He's sitting there eating, and then this, what he calls this robot woman, comes in and sits down, and he describes her, how she sits like this, and she's got her magazine, and she's circling all the things in her radio schedule, and he just talks about how curious she is. And then she gets up to leave, and he says, I didn't have anything better to do, so I left as well, and I followed her for a while. She positioned herself right next to the curb and was making her way with incredible speed and assurance, never once swerving or looking around. I eventually lost sight of her and turned back. I thought about how peculiar she was, but then I forgot all about her. It's this throwaway moment in the book that, I mean, Claire read it yesterday, so she might remember it, but probably no one else does, okay? But it's always struck me as odd and a little creepy, okay? And so I'm wondering, what if I make Meursault just a bit creepier, okay? So that he doesn't forget all about her. What if he doesn't turn back and he keeps following this woman and he's fascinated by how oblivious she is to her surroundings, particularly when she turns onto her dark street in Babeloued, where the street light hasn't worked for years, and tucks into her shabby building with the pitch black foyer, where it would be very easy to follow her inside, which he doesn't do. Instead of doing that, Meursault rushes home and writes a short story as Raymond, doing all these things, watching her at the cafe, following her down to the street, into the dark foyer, up into her apartment, and assaulting her. And then, like Stanley Kowalski, after raping Blanche, somehow convincing himself in his mind that she enjoyed that. And so Meursault enters this strange psychological gray zone with something very dark looming on the periphery of it. His fascination with his neighbor reaches a peak right after Raymond's fight on the beach with the Arab, where the Arab slashes him, and then Meursault follows Raymond as he walks down the beach looking for the guy. When they find him, Raymond takes out the gun, and as I mentioned in the original, Camus has him inexplicably talk Raymond out of shooting the Arab, okay? The way I'm reimagining the scene is to thrust Meursault fully into the role of observing writer. He follows Raymond down the beach not because he's worried about what he will do, but because he wants to see what he does. So that when Raymond sees the Arab, takes out his gun, part of Meursault comes to life, okay? When Raymond takes aim, Meursault focuses his mind, his senses, his entire being, because he wants to fully absorb and experience this moment. And then Raymond doesn't pull the trigger. And Meursault feels cheated. Like he got to the end of this thrilling book, found that the last page had been ripped out, and he can never find this text again. Raymond, however, is relieved. And he kind of jokingly tosses the gun to Meursault and says, yeah, you show him this, and they remember whose beach it is. They walk back to the beach cottage. Raymond joins the other, but Meursault turns around and walks back to the beach again because he wants to mentally relive this moment, kind of take notes on it, okay? And also imagine it happening a little differently. Imagine a different Raymond who doesn't walk up to the precipice only to step back, but who jumps off the cliff and pulls the trigger. Meursault wants to absorb all that sensory psychological detail of the water and the beach and the sun so that when he gets home, he can write down this other version of Raymond. But then he reaches the rock with the shade, and to his surprise, Raymond's man is back. I look at the Arab lying there in my oasis, and I realize he's not going anywhere. He hasn't moved, and he never will. I know that all I have to do is turn around and go back to where I came from, and my story will be written. But I step forward, and the Arab draws his knife, and a white-hot blade of light shoots off the steel and slashes my eyes. Then he smiles and swivels the knife back and forth, and the light dances in and out of my eyes, blinding white, and his smile, and white, and smile, and white, and smile, and again, and again, and again, and the trigger surrenders without a struggle, and the gun makes a hollow pop, and the Arab slumps over, unconvincingly, and stays like that. Stuck in that absurd position, like an actor who's died badly, and now all he can do is play dead badly, holding his breath and waiting for someone to say, cut, so he can sit back up and try it again and hopefully get it right this time. But no one says anything, and the Arab doesn't move. So I shoot him again, and again, and again, and again. It's like gently knocking 4 times on the gates of my immortality. So the rest of this, which I'll just quickly summarize, and we'll get to the end here. Part 2 addresses what I think is the main omission and problem with Camus' The Stranger, which is, in Algérie Française, the odds of a white European man being convicted of killing an Arab with a knife, which he has just used to cut another white European man an hour earlier, are 0, okay? Even my cat, who has one eye and no legal training to speak of, could represent Meursault and get him off of this charge, okay? All he has to do is say self-defense, okay? Now, Camus' explication for Meursault not doing this is Meursault refuses to play the game. He refuses to lie, as if it's some high-minded idea that he's chosen to live by. Maybe so. But actually, Meursault doesn't say this, that it's some choice. So here's my theory. Meursault doesn't lie because he's an idiot, okay? Because he's too tired and bored and indifferent during his own trial to even care about how it turns out. And if he doesn't care, why should I care, okay? My Meursault finally decides that he does care, and along with his lawyer, who is much slicker than this lame brain in the original, they create a very convincing alternative narrative leading up to the moment that Meursault defends himself, his fiancée, his friends, his country, and regrettably has no choice but to kill the Arab. Okay? The trial begins. He tells this recreated story to a jury of his peers and to a sympathetic public, and he has got them all fooled, all except the prosecutor who knows he's guilty, but he can't prove it. But in a last-ditch effort to trip Meursault up, he says, "Really? That's your story? You feared for your life? Come on. I bet you've got a much better story in there somewhere." And Meursault realizes he's got a choice to make. He can stick with his cliché story, or he can tell a better one. He can choose between freedom or immortality. So he chooses immortality, is condemned to death. He finishes his book, he falls into a peaceful sleep and waits for executioners to come for him at dawn, but is awoken in the middle of the night to the sounds of explosions and gunfire, because it is midnight, November 1st, 1954, and the War of Independence has begun. His execution is postponed for a day, and another day, and a week, and a month, and a year, long enough so that Meursault's cold-blooded murder becomes something else, something patriotic, something even heroic. I'm going to stop there so that if this book ever sees the light of day, you'll have reason to go buy it, and I will be showered with millions and millions of Lebanese lira, at least 2 million, I'm hoping. So to end this, to wrap it up, in order to wrap up my investigation, I went to Algiers last year, and I was looking for 2 women. The first was this woman, who plays Hasiba bin Bouali in the Battle of Algiers and dies along with Brahim Hajjaj and Ali Lapointe. I wanted to know what it was like to be a nameless icon of film history and then basically vanish without a trace. And I asked everyone I talked to what her name was and where I might find her, and nobody knew her name, and they had no idea where to find her. And I kept hitting dead ends, and then by chance, I found her. And she agreed to meet me, and so I sat down with her and her beautiful daughter, Dalila, who was also just a very kind, lovely person. And so I asked her if there was any experience that she had had during the war that would prepare her for this famous checkpoint scene. You know, as an actor, did you have some kind of real life experiences? And she very calmly said, yes, my husband was killed about a month before the war ended. I was just like, I was so stunned that it completely threw me off my sort of sequence, and I did not ask her anything else about that. So that when she made this film, she was actually a young widow with 1 child. After it comes out, she gets dozens of offers to make films all over Europe, but she was done. And so I told her, wow, it's like you had the perfect career, right? You made 1 film, and it was a classic. And she said, yes, that's true. I never made a bad movie. And then her beautiful daughter and she, Dalila, drove Madame Hanin home, and her husband came out to greet us. And Madame Hanin told me that unfortunately both her daughters were taken, but that if I ever came back to Algiers, she would find me a wife. Then she held out her hand to say goodbye, and her daughter said, Maman, it's okay, you can kiss him. When Papa was younger, he would have been very angry, but now, ça va. And so Hasiba bin Bouali kissed me on the cheek, and nothing can ever change that. The second woman that I went looking for, and I knew that I had arrived too late for her, but I went looking for her all the same, which is Camus' mother. I knew that she had died in Algiers, but I couldn't get any information as to where she was actually buried. Okay? So I went to the Christian cemetery in the heights above Belcourt, which is the tough working class district that Camus grew up in, to this overgrown, hauntingly beautiful spot high above the city, looking over the sea. And I spoke to the old caretaker there, who made me think of the caretaker in The Stranger. He had never heard of Camus, and also obviously had no idea whether his mother was buried there. But he wrote down her name, Catherine Marie Synthèse Camus. So Marie, like Meursault's girlfriend, Synthèse, like Meursault's neighbor, Raymond Synthèse. And the caretaker took my number and said he would ask his colleague, who'd been there longer than he had, and that he would call me if he found out anything. And then a few days later, he does call and said, "J'ai trouvé la mer." And a half an hour later, he opens the gates for me, and then without a word, he leads me down the hill to the very bottom of the cemetery, and he points to a stone, and then he walks off, he steps away to watch over from a distance. So Camus' mother was illiterate. She supported her family cleaning houses. In her later years, she barely spoke. She was practically mute. And when the family gave her the news that Camus had died in a car wreck, all she said was, "Trop jeune," too young. And then 9 months later, she also died and was buried there in Algiers with a sea between her and her son. And though I don't really have much feeling for Camus, one way or the other, when I saw her grave, I wept. There she is. Thank you. Oh, that was long, sorry. Do we even have time for Q&A? Okay, if people need to, I'm sorry, that was longer than I thought. If people need to slip away, I understand, but I'm also happy to take any questions. I'm going to stand up. Ugh. I'll see you later. Yes?
Are you going to tell us if you think Meursault was a racist or not?
I will. I will. So here's the thing about that. I'm teaching this class, and I ask all my students, is this a colonial book? And hands come up one way or the other, and I say, is it a racist book? Is Meursault a racist? And most of the students say yes. And then I ask them why. And they say, well, he writes a letter to the Arab girlfriend, and then he shoots the brother. Okay? And so, which is true. Okay? And so, but if you look back at the actual sequence of the scene, the sequence is first he agrees to write the letter, and then he finds out that it's intended for an Arab. So when I think about Meursault's alternate strangers, it's conceivable that if Raymond had said, yeah, her name is Marie-Claude, then Meursault would have grabbed the pen and written a letter to Marie-Claude, and then if Marie-Claude's angry brother Jean-Luc shows up waving a knife, Meursault probably would have just have shot him in as blasé a fashion, okay? Which, the reason this is interesting, and I say that not to he's not a racist, to defend him. I don't like this guy, but I think it's part of this clever or insidious thing that Meursault does to make it impossible to know who this guy is or why he does anything. Okay? It's part of this alibi that I'm talking about. Why does he kill him? So to me, is he a racist or not? I don't know. To me, he's an indifferentist towards Arabs, which in this case is just as bad.
That's racist too.
It is a form of racist, but in the end, it's like when somebody's shooting at you for no reason, it really doesn't matter why. So he's an indifferent. Is he a racist? It's almost as if he can't be bothered, which, yes, is a form of racism. So.
He's almost autistic. He has no emotions except for a little happiness when he's with someone beautiful, or he doesn't have feelings. He's not believable as a person in that way.
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I think even a sociopath would probably think about the crime that landed him in prison for longer than Meursault does. I mean, as far as emotions, he's a little bit contradictory, and I think it's part of his sociopathy, because he does have flashes of emotions. They're just not about the things that normal people are, because he talks about Algiers as a city I've always been happy in, and I'm happy swimming with Marie, and he gets thrilled every time he, looks at her body and sees how she's filling out whatever dress she's wearing that day. So he's very engaged with certain things, right? But not like a normal person. Okay, which is, I mean, for me, which is why I have this like ambivalence about the sort of, kind of post-colonial kind of critique of it, which again I agree on, but it's just like, but in terms of like what Camus' view of the world is, like who cares? I mean, this guy there's something wrong with him, If the book told me, oh, this is this wonderful person who's doing something, then I'd be like, no, he's not. So that's why I think that Camus is doing something very tricky here. Actually, no, I don't know that. Is he doing something? I have no idea whether he did all this on purpose or just because it just came out. And I doubt he knew either while he was writing it. And I think that the explanation that he gives for the book is very much like an alibi that someone does after a crime that doesn't quite make sense for what they did. So, yeah, that's my feeling about that. Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, it's everything you said until you got to your story was all about how open-ended and completely impossible it is to say anything definitive about the story. But on the other hand, your story sort of attempts to wrap it up. And I don't know, I mean, it just seems like there's such a contrast between this indeterminability about this story and then your desire to, not 3 times on my immortality. And I mean, do you feel like that's what you're doing?
I do, because actually it's in a sense it is explaining, it is giving an explanation for something that Camus doesn't in the text. So in that sense, it is giving a rationale. What I would like to do is at the same time make that rationale like irrational or something that, that to have him do things that are absurd even in the context of that. So that the idea of getting so involved while you're thinking about a short story that you actually end up shooting someone and then don't do the easy thing and say, oh yeah, it was self-defense. So that I still want to have him kind of ricocheting between rationality and irrationality. But you're right. It is presenting an explanation for his actions, which is, probably makes me guilty of what a lot of other people are guilty of in terms of trying to explain Meursault. To me, there is no explanation for what he does. So, yes.
Can you explain your seemingly deep connection with Camus' mother, because we only hear about her in the last 5 minutes of your talk, but you were clearly affected by her story.
Mhm.
Can you explain that?
My being affected by her
Yeah,
story?
because it was a little interesting because we didn't hear about her throughout the whole talk, and it's just like your trip and that last 5 minutes, and you were so clearly affected by it.
I'm affected by her because I feel like, unlike Merceau, I mean, Camus basically made a choice to be on the wrong side of history vis-a-vis the Algeria question. Many of the colonials there were making the wrong choice in terms of like, they're not having any problem with the colonial system or having any interest to change it. I see her as a bit more innocent of that just because she was born dirt poor, and until Camus started to have some success as a writer, was just kind of slogging away and working in this very kind of unhappy existence. And that, I mean, not only did she not speak, but there was some people weren't even sure that if she really fully grasped what was going on around her, that her son was now famous or that he'd won the Nobel. I mean, she seemed like puzzled by this Nobel Prize and what that was. So to me, I have a kind of a warm place in my heart for her. And to me, there's also something poignant about the fact that, they bury her there, presumably thinking that the family would live nearby forever. And then 18 months later, they pick up stakes and pack off for Spain. I don't really know, I'm also interested in the idea in that just like I'm imagining this guy, Merceau, writing a book about killing an Arab, and then he kills one. I mean, as an artist, Camus does something, it's a conflation between the two, does something strange in that he imagines his mother dying, okay? So he obviously didn't want her to die, but it's like, even the idea of like sitting going like, okay, I love her, and now she's dead in the ground. So it's, even if she grasped that he wrote a book about this, what would this person, who couldn't even read, sort of think about that? So I don't know. I find her moving in ways that I don't quite understand. And a lot of my reaction to these books, I don't quite understand. So I'm I like Camus a little bit more than I sort of pretend to, because he's certainly interesting. So.
Doyle, I loved your talk.
Thank you.
The complexity of it is just, to me, it's very appealing. I was just wondering about the identity of that Arab. What kind of Arab is that Arab? Is he portrayed in your book as just, the Arab under colonial France, or actually develop a certain, detailed picture in your book? Or is he just, the Camus Arab who is a stick figure, more or less? And what kind, if that is so, what kind of Arab persona does he assume in the book?
When I found out that Kamel Daoud had written a reworking of The Stranger, I was kind of panicked that somebody faster, younger, better looking, and smarter was going to do what I was trying to do. And then I read his book, and I was relieved that it's not what I'm trying to do. And he's writing a book that I can't write. I don't understand Algerian culture the way Kamel Daoud does. Even though I've only spent a few months in Algiers, I do think that I understand French colonial culture because I grew up in Texas colonial culture on some level. And actually, I don't try to make Camus out to be Merceau out to be some sensitive, he understands that. No, he's actually just as indifferent in my version. So I think to find out the complexities of that person you're talking for, the Meursault investigation is your book, because I want to make him interested in the Arab only from an artistic point of view that he shot him, period. The only thing I do is that at a certain point, towards the end of the trial, the prosecutor says, "Do you even know the name of the guy that you killed?" And so what Meursault tells us is that, of course I know. And he says that, he doesn't say this, he thinks it. Of course I know. There was just no point to say it. But the prosecutor doesn't know that, and so he lies, and he just says, "No, do you?" And so he kind of purposefully does this as this kind of legal suicide to get himself condemned. So. Yes, okay.
I have like one more.
Okay.
It's very brief. And obviously it's risky talking about the novel based on your description of the novel, having not read the novel. So excuse me if this is like not what happens in it. But what I was interested in your description is that you kind of give us another unsolved crime, in that you give us the assault of this woman.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it's a short story within the novel, but it's kind of still happening. And so I was just interested in whether you could talk a little bit about this unnamed woman who is in The Stranger, but very fleetingly, and she's kind of unnamed in passing,
Mm-hmm.
whereas it seems like in your novel she is unnamed in a more long-term significant way that kind of mimics the unnamed Arab that Meursault kills. So I just wondered if you could maybe talk through that decision a little bit more.
Well, I mean, just that he takes Raymond's attitude about women, that they're something to have around and pay a little rent for and hit on occasion if they get out of line, and then, enjoy physically, and then takes that to maybe not a logical conclusion, but certainly to a more extreme conclusion, and basically he's just, that Meursault is fascinated with people who do things that he would never do, which I think, on some level, is what writing is. Part of when Camus writes The Stranger is that he gets to pretend what someone like him, because Meursault is perhaps an alternate Camus. Camus, I'm assuming didn't kill anyone, but then he gets to write a book. He writes a book where he gets to sort of live that, and so that's what Meursault is doing in terms of taking this strange or stranger kind of behavior and pushing it to a great extreme. But I actually think that beyond finishing this kind of, then I have in the story that Raymond walks home at the end of that and stops off at his favorite bar and plays a game of pool and has a couple of drinks and goes home, and then he doesn't think about her for a week, and then he wonders what she's up to, and if he'll bump into her again, and then out of his brain again. So it's a very detached view of that woman. He's kind of, which is not my view, but
It's very comparable.
Yeah. Mhm. Thank you all, the last four of you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for coming, Patrick. Oh, I'm getting de-wired.